Today we're going to answer a question that winemakers have been contemplating for millennia, and that is, what should you do with all these grape skins once you've pressed your wine? If you like winemaking videos like this, make sure to subscribe below and swing by my website, smartwinemaking.com, and you can always get more exclusive content on my Patreon page. So if you've just got into winemaking from grapes, you spend huge money to get these premium grapes, and so much of the flavor is contained in those skins. The wine sits on the skins during fermentation, of course, if we're talking about red wine, but then you press and you throw them in the compost pile, and it just seems like, man, is there something I can be doing with these skins instead of just tossing them into the compost pile? And it's not to say that that's a bad use for skins. I do that all the time, and I've got a really nice compost pile because it. But let's talk about some things that some wineries do with skins, some post-processors do with skins, and then we'll talk about what I've been doing with my skins lately. So wine grape skins are often used for animal feed. Sometimes they're tossed back in the vineyard to restore some nutrients back to the soil. Sometimes they're tossed into the compost pile. One thing you might not know is they're also sometimes used to make cream of tartar. Cream of tartar is potassium bitartrate, which is those little crystals you'll see fall out of the wine when you cold stabilize. So companies can use the old skins, which are basically considered waste, and make some cream of tartar out of it. You probably know about grappa. Grappa is made from used grape skins or pomace, which are these pressed cakes when you press your wine. And it's a brandy-like alcohol that, instead of being distilled from wine, is distilled from these remnants of the skins. But here's what I've been doing with my grape skins, and I think it kind of helps to extend them a little bit, get a little bit more bang for your buck out of it, because again, you're spending big money on these grapes. You hate to just make a little bit of wine and chuck them. I've been buying pretty inexpensive wine kits, and normally you'll make a wine kit, a juice concentrate kit. You can buy Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot. You can buy from different regions, and you can buy all different price levels. Well, at the top price level, which you're talking about $200 about for 6 gallons, it'll often come with a little grape skin pack. And even at this price point, it's not anywhere near what you're going to get from fermenting a wine on the skins. It bridges the gap, certainly, but it's really not there. So what I've been doing is buying these more inexpensive wine kits, which anymore have gotten a lot more expensive than they used to be, but I've got a couple RJS wine kits. They're about $70 each, and I mixed them up with water. I've done this a couple times. Often I'll mix up with, instead of 6 gallons, I'll mix with 5 gallons. And the other time I've done it, I mixed with 6 gallons. And take those press cakes and throw them into that batch of wine and let it actually ferment on real skins, and not just a little packet of them. We're talking, 10, 20 pounds of skins to 6 gallons of wine. This idea is not completely unheard of. In Italy, there's a wine called Ripasso, which is when they take a red grape, ferment it on the skins just as usual, but when you would normally be done fermenting, they press it, and then they take the used skins from Amarone, which is a really premium wine that it's unique in that the grapes are dried before fermentation. So they reuse the leftover skins from that process, throw it back into this wine, and let it keep on fermenting. So they just get an incredible amount of skin time on these wines, and it can kind of make maybe a little better, more complex, more flavorful wine out of a wine that would have otherwise been kind of thin or one-dimensional. One complaint I often have with wine kits is just that, is that they often come out pretty thin. Sure, they taste pretty good in about a month, which that's great if you don't want to wait, but if you want to make an ultra premium wine, they're not the thing to do it from usually. These wines from grapes are usually way more intense from the start. So much so that they're almost undrinkable, but given time, they mature into just a much better, much more complex, just like you would get at a premium top shelf store-bought wine. For my couple experiments that I ran, I chose a couple different kits. I chose RJS Merlot and an RJS Malbec, and those are the Grand Cru, which are, I would say, kind of an entry-level wine kit. See, it's wine season because fruit flies coming around as the fermentation is going on. But anyways, yeah, those are pretty much your entry-level wine kits. And I mixed them 50-50. So those kits that would normally make 6 gallons, I've done it 2 different ways. So the first way I did it is I turned each of those kits into 5 gallons, still mixed them together to make 10 gallons. And I put about, I would say 2 to 2.5 full press cakes from a small 4 or 5 gallon basket press. So this is when you fill that basket press all the way to the top, can't fill it anymore, and you press it all the way down, and you're left with about 6 to 8 inches of pomace or grape skin. What I found that I've had to do with those kits is add just a tiny bit of potassium carbonate or potassium bicarbonate to bump the pH up a tiny bit. Kits are also funny in that, should you do malolactic fermentation? Usually the answer is probably no, and that's probably why they adjust the pH so low on them so that it doesn't accidentally happen. But now you're introducing some malic acid from these grape skins that are coming off your press. So the route that I took is I did perform malolactic fermentation on these, but instead of adding the malolactic bacteria after fermentation, I added partway through fermentation so that if there happens to be some citric acid hanging out in there, which could produce an insane amount of that buttery character that you would get from a malolactic fermentation, well, I'm going to rely on the yeast to kind of metabolize some of that and knock it back down to a normal threshold. Another key learning that I had was, so the first set that I made, I did basically reduce the volume of water to 5 gallons instead of 6 per kit. For that one, I used an old vine zinfandel as my grape skin contributor. Well, on that particular grape, I used some enzymes for fermentation, and those skins were really broke down. Not that big of a deal, but what it did mean was it was a little bit more difficult to do the second pressing. I basically had to press it and then break the cake up and press it one more time at the end. And it was fine. It was just a little bit more labor. But what I'm seeing is that wine is really on track to be way better, way better than what one of these kits would ever be. Of course, it's still pretty intense, but what we know from fermenting lots and lots of wines is that's on track to mellow out, and it'll be a pretty good wine in about a year instead of in about a month. But then it'll also have aging potential, and it'll just be a much higher caliber of a wine. The other set of kits that I'm doing, same kits, but instead we're using petite sirah, and instead of reducing the 6 gallon that you're supposed to do with the kits to 5 gallons per kit, I kept it at 6 gallons because there was no shortage of flavor in that first round. It was intense. It's gonna be a flavor blaster, there's no doubt about it. So this one I'm doing 6 gallons. The petite sirah grapes are a little bit more intact, I would say. It looks like we're not gonna have too much trouble pressing those like we did with the old vine zinfandel. Beyond that, I've had to add a little bit of yeast nutrient. I'm always watching during a fermentation, so you're always trying to achieve this balance during a fermentation where, you know, the wine needs enough air to basically stop it from becoming reductive or starting to get that rotten egg hydrogen sulfide characteristic. It also needs enough nitrogen. So these skins, they've already been fermented. A lot of the nitrogen's been sucked right out of these things. So we've had to supplement with a little bit of Fermade K just to keep things happy. I'm fermenting around the mid 70s, 75 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and I'm keeping the wine on the skins for about a week. And this is all stuff you can kind of dial in. This is an experiment as much as it is anything, but I think it's a pretty cool experiment, and I wanted to make sure I shared with you guys. As with any red wine, you're still gonna punch down. I'm punching down 2 to 3 times a day. And again, that kind of leans towards what's the wine doing. Is the wine leaning a little bit reductive? Is it staying nice and fruity? Do I think the wine needs air or not needs air? The old vine Zinfandel, I felt that the wine had plenty of air and didn't need any more. So I did my 2 punch downs. I often will put, if I think that's the case, instead of just a sheet over the fermenter, I'll put something like a sheet of plastic, something that's a little bit less breathable, and sniff it every single day and just see how things are going. One interesting thing about doing a second run type wine like this is you don't have to add any yeast. You can be certain that that fermentation is going to kick off. There is so much yeast in those skins that within about, I mean, it feels like almost minutes you're going to start to see bubbling, but probably within about an hour to 3 hours, you're going to start to see that bubbling, which is a lot quicker than when you're trying to start a fermentation from scratch. After fermentation is complete, again, we're just going to press like any other wine, and we're really just going to treat it like a normal wine at that point. I'm going to monitor to see if I think malolactic fermentation is complete. You can watch your pH and watch it climb. I like to keep it a little bit warmer until that's complete, like high 60s to 71, 72 degrees. You can do chromatography tests to assure that malolactic fermentation is complete. You can smell the wine. Often you can smell the diacetyl or the butter component. It's up to you. I wouldn't recommend getting so intense as to run chromatography tests on a wine like this, where the whole purpose is you're just kind of playing around, you're trying to save some money, and you're trying to get a little bit of extra use out of your skins. I'm going to add oak. You can add the oak that came with the kits. I often prefer French oak to American oak. Sometimes I prefer a little bit of a blend of both. And your skins, when you're done with this run, you can throw them in the compost pile. There's a thing I've heard of people doing on some of the winemaking chats. And if anyone's done this, make sure to mention in the comments, because this intrigues me. I don't know if it's a complete waste of time or not, but I have heard of people, instead of doing what I'm doing and using these kits to reprocess your grapes, I've heard of people taking tartaric acid, water, and sugar, and basically making a watery sugar blend where you might have something like, 20 or 22% sugar, and work the acid to your pH of something like 3.3, something where you might want to be for a rosé type wine, and add these skins to it and ferment this like acid sugar water with the skins. And at first I thought, this is nuts. Who would even do this? What kind of like jug wine are people making? But then I started to think about it more, and when we're making a rosé wine, we're barely getting any skin contact time. We're basically pressing this acidulated sugar water with a little bit of skin time and a little bit of flavor from those grapes. So I think it's an experiment that I might try in the future, but I want to know if somebody else has tried this, because if it is like terrible, well, I'll still probably try it in the future, but I want to know what I'm getting into. I hope this video was useful for you. If you've also got some pretty simple questions, I've recently started a Facebook group called Smart Winemaking, where winemakers can help winemakers answer questions in a pretty timely fashion. Good luck with all your wines out there, and thanks for watching.